Welcome to this Bright Blue Ludgate Lecture. I am Tom Nurcombe and I am a senior researcher at Bright Blue. For those who are unfamiliar with Bright Blue, we are the independent think tank for liberal conservatism, and we look to promote and protect a liberal institutionalist and, most importantly, in the context of this lecture, an internationalist Britain. Now, our Ludgate Lecture series brings together the brightest and best minds to tackle the biggest issues of the day. And our speaker today will talk for about 20 minutes before we have a Q&A, and there is a Slido link in the video description where you will be able to ask questions. Now, for those of us who are interested in geopolitics, there is no greater issue than the one that we are discussing today, and that is dealing with China. Now, Britain, since the Second World War, has focused predominantly on the transatlantic partnership, but in more recent years, there has been increased focus to look at other parts of the world as well. Importantly, Britain is now looking to deepen relationships in the Indo-Pacific to deal with the challenge, if we use the language of the government, or the threat that comes from China. We only need to look at the AUKUS partnership and the UK joining the CPTPP as evidence of this. And recently, the Prime Minister wrote in the foreword to the government's integrated review that where there are attempts by the Chinese Communist Party to coerce or create dependencies, we'll work closely with others to push back against them. Meanwhile, the US is also focusing its foreign policy efforts much more heavily to the Indo-Pacific region to also counter China. Now, China's influence on global politics and the global economy is only set to increase in the following years and decades. So the question arises, how do we deal with this rise of Chinese influence? Now, to discuss this, we have the great pleasure to have the Right Honourable Sir Iain Duncan Smith MP to talk with us. Iain is the former leader of the Conservative Party and former Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, and he is a Member of Parliament for Chingford and Woodford Green. He is also one of a number of parliamentarians who has been sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party for speaking out against human rights abuses in Xinjiang province in China. Now, please let's amplify the arguments made today by tweeting and using the hashtag BrightBlue and using our Twitter handle at WeAreBrightBlue. Now, this is a really exciting talk. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Iain.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll try and be as brief as possible, take us through as many questions as I possibly can. Can I just thank you, Thomas, for introducing me. I want to merge two elements together today in the course of what I have to say. The first is that I want to talk specifically about China, and the second part is what I believe China is busy constructing at the moment, which poses a wider threat to us here in the free world. So first of all, let me start by saying that the issue of China isn't erupting suddenly. It's been there, spotted by a number of people, the concerns that you have when you deal with a government which has the most terrible human rights record. If you think about the nature of genocide in Xinjiang, for which I and others were sanctioned for raising this, we had leaked documents from officials that showed that there was a systematic eradication of an ethnic group in Xinjiang. Of course, it's never made it to the criminal court for the very simple reason that China will ensure that it never does. And the main point, though, is that the independent committee here, run by Sir Geoffrey Nice, came to the conclusion after a long period of reviewing the data and the information that there was almost certainly a genocide taking place. So, as well as the genocide, those who are involved in it are involved in slave labor as well. So they're not alone. The Tibetan have about 250,000 Tibetan men in forced labor, and there are many others as well from around China. So one of the areas that is always a concern to us is that we have rushed to China to invest in China over the last decade and a half. More than that, actually. And what's actually happened, we've managed to buy, therefore, cheaper goods, but the cost of that cheaper goods has never been found in terms of their human rights. And so what China does with a lot of goods is to use forced labor to make sure that their production is cheap. It's the first thing. So with all of that, we've become distinctly dependent on China in a way that I can't remember us being as dependent on another country for certainly in modern times. And it gets more dependent if you think about where we're heading with the huge green agenda. Those who want us to be completely at net zero, even though the UK is in itself pretty clean, certainly by comparison with its competitors. But that notwithstanding, the rush to green means that the door continues to be wide open to China to dominate in industries and therefore for us to be dependent on them. So if you think about wind farms, solar arrays, batteries, and electric vehicles, all of these pretty much, the vast majority are now produced in China. So the insides of most of the arrays that are actually the wind farms that are set up in the North Sea are very much Chinese made and shipped over. And the same goes with solar arrays, with batteries. They dominate the battery market. They also dominate the rare earth minerals market. Lithium is not a rare earth mineral, so people get confused between the two. It is vital to batteries, and there is a big debate about why it is that we have not made sure that we have our own production, our own capability in that. But that notwithstanding, they dominate in that. But the rare earth minerals are the things that go towards making the little magnets that exist inside our telephones and all of our electronic equipment, without which basically none of this stuff, the thing I'm on at the moment, wouldn't be working. It's really, I guess, the best way of comparing it is rare earth minerals are, in fact, the kind of oil of the 21st century. They are vital to all we do, and China has about 85% of the mines, 85%, and certainly around about 90% of all the production. Interestingly, Japan took up their own because to make their own, because for the very simple reason that they were banned by China from using Chinese made, and that had a big impact on Japan, but they've now changed that. So all of this has made us even more dependent than we would have been otherwise. And the last thing I want to say about the green agenda is, interestingly, that no one who ever marches for these things and demands that we put up solar arrays, etc., ever asks the question, where does the polysilicates come from that essentially make up the arrays? Well, the answer is they're almost certainly mostly mined in Xinjiang. And we know for pretty certain facts that they are mined and produced using slave labor. So the first thing is on the human rights record, that notwithstanding Hong Kong, the terrible abuses taking place, the fake arrests, the crackdown and the national security law, all of that stuff is going on, the crackdown on Christians and on the Falun Gong that exists in China, and now the beginnings of a real crackdown on Inner Mongolia, which is in the north of China as well. So China's human rights record isn't just bad, it is astonishingly bad and ignored almost certainly by most of Western nations that seek to do business with China. They turn a blind eye to quite a lot of it, and it's really a big problem for us in that regard. So dominated now by China in so much of the production. But more than that, also, I want to add another feature, which is really not. So China itself is absolutely dominant in genomics and in AI. AI, they've probably got a significant lead in that, certainly in the way that they have invested in it using artificial intelligence. But also now what they're doing is fascinating. There's a very important company in China called BGI, and they're probably the biggest genomics company in the world. They are now working closely with AI contributors. So they want to bring together genomics and AI. And of course, the West, yet again, really stupid about this. During the course of COVID, most of the COVID testing systems were made by BGI. And BGI were allowed to retain a chunk of data, genomics data, that came with those. They've been doing the same, by the way, with pregnancy testing, because they are also produced by BGI. And that genomic data is taken to look at, it opens the door to looking at the weaknesses of certain ethnic groups and of certain nationalities. And by combining that with AI, of course, that will make the whole idea of replicating individuals as well very much more powerful. And that's something which, frankly, we've not even begun to debate over here. So they also, by the way, collect data forcibly as well on genomics. But all of that gives you a picture of the nature of the country that we are dealing with internally. They, of course, now have the second largest economy in the world, and they are setting themselves to have significantly the second largest navy and military. Hopefully, they say that they will overtake the United States in due course. Well, we'll see whether that happens, but certainly the state that they are at the moment is also worrying, and the direct threats that you have to Taiwan, which is going on constantly, even though there's not much reported, the overflight, the threats, the diverting of commercial flights, all that pressure is on Taiwan permanently. And I remind everybody, Taiwan isn't just an issue for China. If Taiwan was to somehow fall into the hands completely of China, or for there to go to war, you're dealing with a staggering amount of the global economy that is dependent now on Taiwan. So first and foremost, our own commercial interests take us to Taiwan, and also our interests in terms of the dominance of China. So all of that is what's going on in China. They have aspirations and determination. They've taken over the South China Seas against the UN's statements on it, but they had no historic right to it. You've got conflict now taking place, little clashes. Many of you saw the film of the Chinese ships trying to drive the Philippine Coast Guard out of the area that they claim. All of this goes on permanently. They're building fortified islands in the area. Of course, why are they so interested in the South China Seas? Well, it's because of oil more than anything else. And they want to dominate what may be able to be retrieved out of those areas, and to drive not just the Philippines, by the way, but also Vietnam, who has interest, and all they claim to elements of that process. And some of them are stronger claims than China has made, but China has stepped in fast and used their military to try and dominate the area. And that will and could become a flashpoint in the future. It is right that the UK, I believe, gets involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership for the very simple reason that I think our interests, as I've tried to lay out there, now through South China Seas and into Taiwan, they are directly our interests. They're not just a far and distant country, or a far and distant land, or a far and distant problem. They are, in fact, relevant to us. Our economy will be dependent on what happens in that area. And therefore, the idea that China could join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they're next up, by the way, without us being in it and blocking it, I think is vitally important to our own interests. And bringing the US into that is also critically important. But I want to also talk a little bit here about not just the threat of China, but what China is doing on a wider front altogether. China is setting up this thing I refer to as the new authoritarian axis, the totalitarian states, the axis of totalitarian states that now is obviously China. China has brought North Korea into the fold on this one. And North Korea, you'll note the other day, has done a deal brokered by China with Russia to provide munitions and weapons. Who's to say that quite a lot of those may probably end up being made in China, but shipped via North Korea to be rebadged. But notwithstanding that, Russia is now getting the kind of level of equipment that is necessary, including technology, from China, even though China denies it. The second part of that is that the other country that's heavily involved in this new axis is, of course, Iran. Iran is now very close to China and has been helping, we know, Russia in its war in Ukraine, not just with drones, but also other technology as well, shared, no doubt, with China. The other thing they've done, of course, which is fascinating, and you can see also Syria now involved in that, and many other countries in the Middle East beginning to lean towards China, mostly because I suspect economically, China is going to dominate the demand for oil and gas in the next few decades. And that is, of course, a big issue for those countries that produce it. But beyond that, you ask, well, what else could the Axis do? Well, if we have a look at Palestine right now, you can see really how you can use this, or they could use this Axis to take the pressure off Russia. So the brutal attacks in Israel back in October last year were no accident. They were engineered by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And what they were doing was making sure that they knew what the reaction of Israel would be. It was almost certain that Israel would have to go in and go in hard, and that they knew would suck in the United States, because, of course, their commitment to Israel throughout this process in terms of arms and equipment, that also took the pressure off Russia, which is really critical. During that period, you've seen the debate been raging in the United States about whether or not they should vote for the money, that 60 billion pounds, that rather dollars, that was going to be given in terms of arms and weapons to the Ukrainians to defend themselves, was stalled as a result through the debates. Well, that partly due to the domestic policy, but also when I went over there to talk to the Republican congressmen and women, they all spouted the same line, which is, it's not our war. We need to defend Israel. Europe needs to do more in Ukraine, and Europe should be doing it. Now, of course, that is correct. Much of Europe isn't doing very much in Ukraine, but that doesn't get away from the fact that for Ukraine's survival, they needed the money and the weaponry that only the US is able to produce and provide in large amounts. And so that that delay has led to pressure coming off Russia, and now the pressure on Ukraine. You can see the development of that with the new assaults that Russia's taking, the probing that they're doing, I suspect with a view to making a big frontal assault at some stage. But notwithstanding that, that has literally made it more difficult for Ukraine. And of course, the whole idea of sucking in the United States and some of our allies into the area of Palestine has been a big, big plus for Russia. So the axis of totalitarian states is absolutely critical. It is very much what China is at the heart of building. And you can see from that standpoint just exactly how this has worked. And so we are sitting here without even recognizing all of that that's going on. The UK government, for example, still does not want to call China in any way any kind of threat, even though the Prime Minister, before he became Prime Minister, referred to them as a systemic threat. The language in the integrated review literally at times sounds like it came from, yes, Prime Minister. The scriptwriters there would have been proud of it. We now refer to China as a epoch-defining challenge. And when confronted by what our policy was towards to deal with that, we're going to deal with it with the robust pragmatism. You can almost see Sir Humphrey smiling as he produces the last line. This is not a policy. This is an excuse for not wanting to take a tougher position with China. China poses a distinct threat to us. It's not just about territorial ambitions. It's also about their ambitions, as President Xi has made very clear over many, many years, that he sees that the Chinese form of government as the natural order of things, the natural form of government. He believes that the concept of democracy, human rights, the rule of law, all of that, and the freedoms that we take under that for granted, these are aberrations over the last 200 to 300 years. They are not something he believes that will withstand the nature of the organization now that he and others in that totalitarian axis can wield. And so to that extent, his view is to speed that collapse of the free world's dominance and to institute a greater level of dominance of those totalitarian states. And it's happening right now. It's happening in plain view, in plain sight. But too many of our governments simply don't want to face up to it. And the answer to that is why? It's because we've become far too dominant economically on China, willingly. We are about to get more dependent, rather. We're getting more dependent on China as the Green Revolution moves on. We've made little effort whatsoever to confront the nature of what is produced, where it is produced, how it is produced, and who produces it. Choosing instead, I think, most of the time to avoid that question for fear of upsetting the Chinese. And that is, I'm afraid, the problem for us. Now, America is already now moving in the right direction on that, but most of Western Europe is still locked in that dependency, greater or not, to China, and the UK is one of those. So the question really for us is, on the basis that this dominance by China is completely different from the Cold War, where Russia was dominant, but it did so on a tiny economy that literally was not capable of matching the Americans and the West when they put their minds to it. I mean, I always ask this question, who can remember anything they ever bought made in the Soviet Union? And the answer is nobody. Who can say the last time they didn't buy something from China and were able to identify what it was being made in China? And the answer is pretty much everybody, regularly on a daily basis. basically invest themselves in the Chinese economy. That's us and governments. And so the question for us right now, that the reality for us all is that we now have to confront that dependency. We need to recognize that China is clearly completely at the heart of this process of undermining the nature of how we live our lives, internally and externally, and that we need to start making policies that bring back huge issues like value-added manufacturing, make sure that we are in the competitive market on things like rare earth minerals and lithium, that we start questioning whether or not our rush to net zero can be sustained if we are ourselves not producing anything that is relevant to it. And finally, redefining China as a threat. They are a threat. I believe we are now facing a biggest threat that we've had since the ending of the Cold War. And in a way, I think somewhat more dangerous. More dangerous because we're not in the same boat, as I said earlier, facing an economy that can be outbid and outspent. We are now facing an economy that is every bit as powerful now as the United States, and in many cases more powerful than what goes on in Europe. And that poses us a significant challenge because we are part of that economy. Extricating ourselves from that and changing the nature of how we do business is a long and slow process. But in the meantime, China is building its capabilities to be able to confront us in every single act. And I think that is the problem, and we need to face up to it now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Iain. That's incredibly thoughtful, and also focusing on the geopolitical and the commercial side of things is incredibly valuable for those who are looking at China in the media or students as well. Now, you mentioned about China with Taiwan and the South China Sea and the particular threat that has. Broader around the world, you've got the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, this is sometimes overlooked when you look at the military capabilities of China, but the initiative, which has trade and investment routes from China through Asia into Africa and more recently into the Western Hemisphere with the Caribbean. With that, there's been a lot of claims from skeptics that this constitutes a type of debt trap diplomacy, while other people have suggested that claims that it is debt trap diplomacy conform to the China threat narrative. Would you agree that the Belt and Road Initiative is debt trap diplomacy, and taking into consideration your ideas of the new totalitarian axis, do you think the Belt and Road Initiative could expand that axis?
I think the Belt and Road was always a strategic position that for China to take. It was to ensure, first and foremost, that in the key areas that they had access to the kind of raw materials that they needed. And you'll find in many of the countries in Africa that they're involved with, that's where much of the rare earth mineral mines where they exist, and their investment in that process is critical. As I say, it's allowed them to corner the market in rare earth minerals for the last 10 or 15 years, and made the UK and other Western countries go to them. So that's one element that is both commercial and strategic. So the Belt and Road is not anything other than strategic in its mix. It does two things. First of all, it offers money at what appears to be cheap rates to developing countries, and the West hasn't seriously yet met that or challenged it in any shape or form. Normal Western aid is much tighter than what China offers in that sense. The second part of it is that they don't realize at the time that when they buy into this Belt and Road Initiative, what they end up having to do is to buy things made by China in China. So their engineers will go to build roads, but they don't train new engineers in those countries. They build the roads. They often send workforce out there. They live in cantonments. They do not mix with the wider public. But then comes the moment when those countries can no longer afford the repayments that were necessary. And China has a very simple answer to a lot of that, which is they simply take over elements of things that they were doing. One of the best, most recent examples is the port in Sri Lanka, which, although it's still officially owned by the government, is in fact run completely now for the benefit of China. So you now got Chinese ships involved in there, and even warships now. So America looks out and realizes suddenly China is facing across that expanse that was once dominated by the US. Also look very carefully, Belt and Road's heavily involved in the South Sea Islands, So many of those have been turning to China as well. We forget about that, and that's quite strategic, quite critical. And then, of course, you've got, I think, rather stupid Western nations have also done some of that. I think one of the states in Australia, I think it was Victoria, got involved in Belt and Road, although I gather they've now backed out. Italy, I think, was involved in Belt and Road. So it's not just developing nations, it's others that think they can get a cheap deal and Chinese investment. Chinese investment is not cheap because it comes with all sorts of demands. Now, you only have to look at how successful this is by looking at the non-aligned states and their voting patterns. How many of those are receiving Belt and Road money and China's influence now to block things they don't like or to advance things that they're prepared to, which they know troubles America or the UK or other European states? They have now a significant control of that in the UN, and you could argue that they have the ability to block in the UN. So Belt and Road feeds the position that I was taking earlier on, which is the axis of totalitarian states. And it is certainly China's long arm that is reaching to areas that we have, I'm afraid, forgotten about.
Now, linking to that, I think with the Belt and Road, there is beyond the economic side of it and the finance side of it, there's the role of language, there's the role of rhetoric in persuading or, in some cases, coercing developing nations to take these loans and investment from China. So phrases like win-win cooperation, no strings attached financing, and a self-identification with the developing world might actually bring developing countries under the arm of China because they're so annoyed with the way that perhaps their financing from the World Bank and IMF have come from the West. With that in mind, do you think that there needs to be some sort of reform to global governance institutions and global financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank so that the West can compete with China in the developing world and ensure that loans are actually mutually beneficial for the West and for the developing world and that they serve the purpose of development?
Yeah, China sells this concept of the Belt and Road to the developing countries on the basis that exactly as you said, that there are sort of no strings attached. In fact, there are very heavy strings attached, but developing nations only realize that once they've got into difficulty over payments, etc. So, the reality is that although they don't come in like like many of us do with overseas aid, is we want to get the best deal, we want to make sure the right circumstance around. Also, it comes with plans to build up people's capability in certain key areas. All of that is stuff that you'll hear successive governments, the UK government, are being proud of what they're doing in those areas. The problem is that that also along that line has laid all sorts of requirements for them to reform their economies and for them to reform perhaps their judicial systems, etc., to give people greater protections. All of that are the sort of things that many of those countries simply don't want to have to engage in. It's an expensive item for them to do that. And so many of them then look at the Belt and Road and say, oh, well, you know what, this doesn't come with those strings. Well, of course it doesn't. China isn't bothered how they govern themselves. What they're bothered about is that they remain tied to China. And so, I mean, there are plenty of cases of this. If you look at what's going on, I think in Nigeria over the 5G work that's taking place, you, as I said, mentioned Sri Lanka. You can name a number of countries that the cost to them comes in later demands and requirements when they aren't able to pay. And by the way, you have to buy Chinese equipment if you're installing anything. So they get their money back pretty damn quickly as well. So it works for China to a huge degree.
No, absolutely. I want to turn now to what's going on in Britain and the Chinese influence in Britain. And something that has been almost overlooked recently is the role of Confucius Institutes in British universities. And there have been certain organizations in Britain who have suggested that these Confucius Institutes promote Chinese propaganda and avoid open and honest conversations, which are really the hallmark of what British education should be about, on sensitive topics like Tibet, on Taiwan, on Tiananmen Square. Do you think that they are, as some have said, a 21st century Trojan horse to advance Chinese interests abroad? And if so, how do we deal with Confucius Institutes in the UK?
Confucius institutes have one purpose, which is the first purpose is to spy on Chinese students in Western universities. And the way they get in, of course, is to offer their services on Chinese culture and language for free, which a lot of universities think, oh, this is great, so we can support our Chinese students. In fact, we all know now, the intelligence services know it, that they report back on Chinese students, and they also ensure when they're there that Chinese students don't get involved in any of the debates that are more likely to undermine the nature of government in China. So you'll see that that where they work on that, many of them, and particularly Hong Kong students that have come over to the UK that are believers perhaps in democracy, they would be watched very carefully by the Confucius Institute. By the way, this is just not the Confucius Institute. You then also got the uh, non-official Chinese police stations that have been set up all over Europe and in America, now absolutely being driven out of America. Holland is moving hard on them. The UK is, it seems to be betwixt and between on this one. We've spotted that there are at least 3 to 4 of these places. What do? They grab those who have expats that have left, and if they can round up their families in China, they'll do links which they will show that their families being threatened in China if they don't return home, particularly expats that have been critical of China. This is what their purpose is to do. Now, they're not here officially as part of embassy, but they still exist. And, we still haven't focused on clearing them out here in the UK. Other countries are doing it. So these are just elements of how the long arm of China reaches in to make sure, in the first one instance, that younger Chinese people don't get involved in imbibing, the concept of human rights, democracy, all that sort of thing. And on the other hand, those who have fled or left China need to be hauled back because their criticisms make China angry, and they don't want them to carry on. So those two elements work together, and you can see it undermining the nature of who we are here in the UK, as well as other European countries in America.
We are getting quite a lot of questions through from our audience. They're all very good questions, so I think I will start taking those. We have one question from an individual who says, will the Western world ever have good relations with China? And can you list what would cause the Western world and China to have to change and facilitate this?
Well, I think the onus is on China to change the way that it works. We did have quite good relations with China prior to President Xi's arrival, when there was a greater level of openness. But that seemed to come clattering to a halt after Tiananmen Square and the brutality of Tiananmen Square. And President Xi, literally on arrival, announced out the point that I was making earlier on, that he actually believes the future is Chinese form of government, and that their purpose is therefore to expand and sell that form of government around the world. So the relationship between China has cooled dramatically, but that notwithstanding, China knows that as long as British and European and American companies get so much of their product made over in China, then they can live with the cooling of relations because the money still flows into China. Their sensitivity is to the money. They have to grow at about 5% a year to stand still. And they're struggling now more than they were before to achieve that necessary goal. So they are very sensitive to UK, European, American investments. And it is that, therefore, that we should be talking about using as a way to sort of bring China back away from its aggressive and confrontational nature of government at the moment.
We have another question from someone who asks, is labeling China as a systemic threat, as opposed to a systemic challenge, as is the current government line, merely a signal? And how would labeling China a threat change the current policy?
Well, actually, it's not just a systemic challenge, it's an epoch-defining challenge, which I'm not quite sure if you can define what that actually means, is beyond me. But anyway, it's a woolly concept. We have a very woolly idea of what China is, mostly because parts of government do not want to do anything to upset the nature of the business between our two countries. And Would it make a difference? Yes. Once you label a country as a systemic threat, which other countries have done with regards to China, then it immediately changes the way that you work with them. So our openness towards China is now has brought in a huge amount of interference into the UK. I mean, a question for me would be, look, if Huawei are seen, and the reason why Huawei didn't get the 5G contract, and I campaigned against it, because for two good reasons. One is that Huawei, backed by the Chinese, the Bank of China, had been had been undermining the market for years by undercutting all the bids made by companies that existed in other parts of the world, so that they'd driven them all out of business, bar three. The second part of it is they are very linked to the Chinese government. All companies in China are, so they have to obey the national security law for data, etc. And that's quite critical. And so when you get to it, if Huawei then were defined later on by the government after having accepted that they were a threat, the question I ask is, why are we therefore allowing Huawei to set up their headquarters in Cambridge? I mean, what do you think they're doing in Cambridge? Anyone want to have a little guess at that? The answer to that, Cambridge, because of all the other investments that are going in and around Cambridge in technology and the huge amount of money flowing into the university to do work on this, which is in many cases groundbreaking. So my question is, if they were down as a threat officially, then we would think again about allowing a sort of investment in that scale by China, which is one way of making sure that ideas and technology that are developed over here doesn't find its way in to China. By the way, China has trashed all the rules around IPs in China. Many medium-sized companies are now leaving China. They no longer can operate in China because it is so difficult. And actually, you can even see elements of larger companies like iPhones are now being made in India because they're worried about some of the technology transfer, and America's leaning on those companies. So we ought to be talking to companies about seeking alternatives now. I think that's critical.
And we've now got a question revolving around Taiwan. Now, we've had, obviously, the Americans would likely get involved if China were to invade Taiwan. And we've got a question here that asks, should the UK intervene militarily if China invades Taiwan?
I don't think this is a decision that the UK themselves, as a government, would take directly. I think it's a matter for the alliance to look at how they respond to this, which is why I say it's so important for the UK to be invested in the Far East, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, to have some sway over whether China is able to dominate that area. And as I said earlier on, Taiwan is our interest because, like all the rest of Europe and America, so much of our economy is based on what comes out of Taiwan. Huge producers of microprocessors, advanced technology as well, which is not allowed in China. Americans have blocked it. It is in Taiwan. That would have an astonishing effect on global economy and global trade, which is really, really important. So all of that does mean it's our interest. So I don't believe that the UK is suddenly going to take action on its own. Those days on a scale as big as this are not going to happen. But it depends hugely how the US sees this and what the US is prepared to do. And then I think the rest of Europe is going to have to decide themselves as whether or not they agree with that idea that Taiwan is also in the sphere of European interest because of so much of our dependency in terms of technology that comes out of Taiwan would absolutely trash our economies. So I would urge other European countries to stake a claim to be in the Far East as well. It's very important because that interest is vital to our future.
You mentioned early on in your speech about AI, and this is obviously going to be one of the defining aspects of the next few decades across the world. And China, with its role in AI, alongside the UK and US, we're going to be at the forefront of it. Do you think that we could involve China in any global regulation on AI? China have famously in the past skirted around the rules around global trade through currency manipulation and tariffs that go against World Trade Organization rules. Do you think there's any chance that we can involve China in AI regulation?
Not at the moment, I don't. No, I think they're busy trying to develop, using, of course, the army technology experts in the Chinese army, and that is all very based around the government. So the Chinese government isn't going to suddenly accept restrictions on the work they're doing. And the point I made earlier on about the coming together of genomics and AI in China is a deliberate decision, because fusing those two areas together could have huge potential for China in the future. You've seen what's happened when COVID, when they failed to point out that their problems they had with COVID early enough on, and the rest of the world caught this particular virus over which they had no defense at the time. That wreaked havoc across the world. In the Western economies have taken a huge hit. All of that. Now, it wasn't done deliberately. I'm pretty certain of that, because China itself has taken an enormous hit. But the whole idea that you bring together narrowly focused viruses aimed at certain fallibilities in different ethnicities is really where we're going here. And AI also building parallel humans, as it were. And I don't mean physically, I mean in terms of their ability to communicate, to interrupt with communications, to confuse states that are maybe a little bit anxious with China. All that sort of stuff is with a potential when those two things come together, and they're the ones working on it, and nobody's even talked about it yet.
And bring us to our last question, because we're a bit pushed on time, and it's quite a big question, actually. So last week, President Biden imposed a series of tariffs on Chinese goods, and you mentioned earlier that the US is starting to take action. There's been enormous tariff rates on Chinese electric vehicles and so forth, which are seeking to protect jobs in American manufacturing, particularly around Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, states like that. However, just this week, your colleague, the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, Bim Afellamy, said that the UK can't afford to give the cold shoulder to China. In the context of this, what do you think could spark action from the government?
Well, I think one of the problems is that the Treasury and the Business Department and others will always focus on the short-term returns. That's what happened on that ridiculous golden decade nonsense that was much loved by George Osborne and co. The main point really is that China has one objective, and this idea that we can't cold shoulder China. No one's asking us to cold shoulder China. I would actually rather like the government to be open-eyed about what is happening. Our drive to net zero has basically now created a whole new area of marketplace where China is breaking every single WTO rule in the book about government subsidy. The very fact now that they are intending to flood Western markets with cheap Chinese electric cars. Most of the battery companies, by the way, which they dominate, we've said we're going to build a giga battery factory. That is tiny by comparison with what China capability in this area is, and we've been late to that. If you look now that what's going on is that they're now even out in London, they're going to have the sort of Route Master replacement buses, which are iconically British, are going to be made in China. As I said earlier on, we've done nothing to call out companies whose supply chains include slave labor in China. We know that for a fact. There are companies now America is using that can spot through forensic science where products were made and whether they were likely to have been using slave labor. And in the big metal bashing industries, you can sure as hell bet that there's a whole load of slave labor in that area as well. But we don't want to ask those questions. And the answer is, we need to be honest about the cost of this. And if we want to get to net zero, we should at the same time be certainly building up our own capability and not desperately taking Chinese goods, which could ultimately be produced. Most of this is produced certainly by computer-aided machines. It's not any longer as labor intensive as it used to be. So we need to start asking questions about what our future is in all of this. Otherwise, we just build that level of dependence, which is the real danger. And that dependence subsequently then leads to our failure to take action because we fear to have lost them as a market, and for us to be able to buy goods off them. And so all that's got to shift and change. But that needs some real strategic thinking. I don't agree with Binan Afalami on this statement because I don't quite know what he means by cold shouldering China. China has already been cold shouldering us and called us a major threat to their project. And so I think our question is really going to be, when are we going to wake up to the fact that we are facing a problem in China which we have been building? And until we decide what we're going to do, we're going to get worse and worse and more dependent. We've got to start breaking that dependency, looking at other markets, looking at other countries where we might want to invest in. But certainly we've got to start changing this single rush to China. Even as I said earlier on, some of the companies are now beginning to call that into question and leaving China. The government now needs to make a view about how it defines China. So it's not about cold shouldering. It's about rational eyes open, understanding what China's purpose is in all of this, and to make sure we don't feed that purpose, which is our number one priority at the moment.
And we've had one final question come through, which is the absolute last question, and it's a fascinating one. It revolves around the special relationship between the UK and the US. Now, we've seen the US shift more towards the Indo-Pacific in its foreign policy aims at the moment. Do you think this has the potential to derail the special relationship and create a new special relationship between the US and potentially Australia or Japan, and sidelining the UK?
No, but I think people always talk about the special relationship and don't really understand what it is. Special relation isn't special because we like each other, that somehow we go, oh, we're best friends with America. That's a fact, which is why politicians come and go. Of course they do. So attitudes to some American politicians, the UK, can be stronger, can be weaker. We've seen the crisis, the Suez crisis, when literally Eisenhower cracked down on the UK. That led to an all-time low in the relationship between the UK and the US. Then we've seen the highs under Thatcher and Reagan, where that relationship was good. It comes and goes to politicians, but the reason why it exists, we call it the special relationship. It's special not because of human beings, populations. It's actually special because of the nature of how our two systems are literally reverse mirror images of each other. So, for example, America adopted common law, slightly changed, but it is nonetheless common law, which is, here, and the rest of the world is now following suit with English common law. So common law makes the basis of an awful lot of how you think. Their concept of democracy, whilst it appears different, was made to settle on the differences that they wanted to have with our form of government. So they build in the potential for gridlock. We tend to have dominance by parties in the House, opposite ends, but in the same kind of process of democracy and system. So if you think about it all of these things, we tend to arrive at general conclusions about world policy, by and large, in a similar time and a similar process, which is why we tend to be there. So the special relationship is special because of the nature of the two countries. Invariably end up, they move away, but they come back, but their general route of travel is going to be roughly the same. As we've seen it time and time again, sometimes more strongly, sometimes less so. And that's the key why special relations exist. It doesn't need politicians to decide that they're going to enhance it or get rid of it. The reality is right now, why is the UK America's single biggest destination for inward investment? Why is the USA the UK's biggest investment? And why is the UK the number one investor in the United States, beating China and all the others? Because our systems that we work in both countries are trusted by both countries because they're very similar to each other. And the property law, the law of contract, all these things based within common law actually very much mirror each other. Not exactly the same, but they're very close. And so it's not such a big deal when you're investing in it to worry about it. So when you look at the Far East, well, what is the UK doing at the moment? It's also shifting to the Indo-Pacific region through the TPP. So I think actually we want to bring America into that. And that would bring us closer together when it comes to the Far East. So yeah, I don't have concerns because I think our natural instincts and our general sense of where things are lies generally parallel we divert occasionally, and it doesn't matter whether President Biden is more skeptical about the UK, perhaps, than Donald Trump would have been or might be if he gets in the future. But it's based on that solid foundation, I think, essentially.
Thank you. Reason to be optimistic about the special relationship. I think we have come to an end there, but that was a fascinating and really insightful discussion. And thank you very much for the points made. And I really hope that a lot of MPs and officials were watching and listening very carefully to your thoughts there. So thank you very much, Iain, for joining us, and we're incredibly grateful for your time. Just to say that our next Ludgate lecture will be next month with Baroness Wolfe of Dulwich, who will be talking about boosting the UK's skills. So please do tune into that. Thank you all very much for watching today, and a special thank you to Sir Iain Duncan Smith for sharing his thoughts with us.